Nos complace presentar esta sesión, la ficción y los espacios intermedios, con Vikram Chandra, Javier Moro, en conversación con Rubén Abella. En esta sesión, los escritores de bestsellers Vikram Chandra y Javier Moro, escritores de ficción, exploran el mundo de la palabra escrita y los procesos que le dan forma. Hablando de las porosas fronteras entre realidad y ficción, imaginación y experiencia, estos escritores excepcionales departen sobre las fuentes de su oficio narrativo. El éxito de ventas del académico y escritor Vikram Chandra, Juegos Sagrados, fue elegido por Netflix para su primera serie original india. También es cofundador y director ejecutivo de Grantica Co., una empresa de software que está reinventando la escritura y la lectura para la era digital. El escritor Javier Moro es el famoso autor del Imperio eres tú, El sari rojo y Pasión india, entre otros. Estarán en conversación con el escritor y académico Rubén Abella. Voy a presentar a cada ponente y les invito a subir a continuación al escenario. El último libro de Vikram Chandra es Geek Sublime, The Beauty of Code, The Code of Beauty. También ha escrito las novelas Juegos Sagrados, Tierra Roja y Lluvia Torrencial, y la colección de relatos Amor y Añoranza en Bombay. Fue productor ejecutivo de la adaptación de Netflix de Juegos Sagrados, un éxito internacional que se incluyó en la lista de The New York Times de las 30 mejores series internacionales de la década. Vikram, si quieres subir al escenario. Javier Moro, aclamado y leído escritor español, es autor de 12 libros. Saltó a los titulares cuando publicó El sari rojo, un libro que creó una enorme polémica en la India. Pasión india, la historia de la bailaora flamenca española que se casó con el Maharaja de Kapurthala en 1906. Ha sido un gran éxito con más de 1,3 millones de ejemplares vendidos. Javier, por favor. Rubén Abella es autor de 5 novelas: Ictus, de 2020, California, de 2015, Baruch en el río, 2011, El libro del amor, esquivo, finalista, que ha sido finalista del prestigioso Premio Nadal en 2009, y La sombra del escapista, Premio Torrente, Ballester, 2002. Un libro de relatos, 15 llamadas perdidas, Premio Kutxa, 2020, y 2 libros de microrelatos, Los ojos de los peces, 2010, y No habría sido igual sin la lluvia, Premio María Vargas Llosa, NH, 2007. Le paso la palabra.
Thank you so much for being here. And let me very briefly, before we get started, let me explain what we three are here to do today. Okay, firstly, we are here to build bridges, which is the main idea of everything that we're going to be doing here today. Bridges between Indian culture in general and Indian storytelling and Indian fiction in particular. Bridges with Spanish culture and Spanish creative writing and fiction writing. So that's the main purpose of this meeting today. And also, something that I find particularly interesting, I don't know if you agree with me here, I get the feeling that contemporary life is making us a little bit self-absorbed. And I believe that one of the main reasons to be here today is about to share the stories of others. I think it's an act of generosity to actually listen to other people tell you their stories. In a way, I believe that writing is very similar to cooking. I don't know if we have any cooks here. In the sense that, we do have an immense amount of ingredients that we can use in our cooking, and basically we have a cooking pot and we throw the ingredients in there in the hope that something delicious and yummy will come out. As I said, the number of ingredients is never ending, but what we're going to do here today is basically talk about what I consider to be the three most important ingredients in creative writing, ingredients without which I believe no fiction writing is possible. Okay, sorry. Sorry. And those three ingredients are memory, imagination, and language. Okay, so we are going to keep it as simple as possible. Okay, let's talk about the first ingredient, which is memory. Let's talk about memory. I don't know if you've, obviously everybody here reads or has read novels. And I don't know if you've noticed the tense in which most novels are written. I'd say more than 90% of the novels are written in a very particular verb tense, which is the past. Okay? Most novels are about things that happened before the story is told. So basically, most novels are based on memory. So we're going to talk about memory first, and the first idea about memory is personal experience. And here comes my first question to Javier and to Vikram. The question is, does your life story shape your fiction writing, and in which ways? And it'd be great if we could use this opportunity to actually mention one specific case, if you can come up with something that you have lived and has actually found its way into your writing.
You want to go ahead? Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here today. It's what an honor to participate in this festival. And well, I don't know what to tell you. Of course, there is a lot of one's life's person in whatever he writes. That's unavoidable because it's your feeling, it's your point of view. I mean, everything goes through your brain. But I'm not a writer, and I don't think Vikram also is. We're not a writer. We don't write self biographies. I don't write about myself. I don't write science fiction. I don't write many things. I do write stories based on real facts. And perhaps because I have a formation of historian, I'm very keen to do a very thorough research and to invent as minimum as possible. In the terms that every time I look at reality, what I find is more striking, more powerful than whatever I can imagine. Because when you imagine, sometimes you're bound by what has to be believable, what has to be plausible. You yourself do your censorship, whether you find things in reality that you cannot invent. And I think this is, for me, the most valuable material with which I build my stuff. For example, when I was writing The Red Sari, I interviewed Ashwini Kumar, who was the head of the Border Police Northwestern Frontier. And he told me the story that after Operation Blue Star, when Indira Gandhi raided the Holy Temple of the Sikh people, the Vatican of the Sikhs, to explain it, in Amritsar, he was very concerned because she had 2 bodyguards that were Sikhs. And he knew that it was a danger for her to keep these bodyguards. And he went to her and says, "Madam, maybe you should get rid of these Sikh bodyguards. Let's replace them for others." And she looked at him and said, aren't we secular, Ashwini? Those things you cannot invent. I mean, that's the richness of history making in a way, you know. But I tell the story in a way that you can read it as a novel. I use the tools of literature to reconstruct pages of history that otherwise are dead already. Ahora te toca.
I think the closest I've come to autobiography in fiction was my first novel, which is partly set in the 20th century, and then the other part is in the early 19th century. And the protagonist of the modern part is a young man who's just returned from the United States, having gone to undergrad college there. And that, I think, was too nakedly revealed that it was me. I didn't even change the name of the college. But everything else besides that, they take a road trip through the United States. That was all invented, right? And I guess I've never done it after that. There are little pieces of me in every fiction that I've written after that, but it's very disguised, right? In completely characters who don't look like me. But the other form of memory, I think, is I completely believe the writers and all artists, we don't just work up here. We work deep inside. We don't understand where things are coming from. It's subterranean. And that also is memory. And then that intersects with cultural memory, right? So my 19th century part it's again based on a real figure, James Skinner, who was a half British, half Indian soldier, became very famous and is still known within Indian army circles. So my vision of that man and his life was culturally biased, or based. And then in pre-modern Indian thinking about aesthetics and so forth, there's a very brilliant man named Abhinavagupta, who's a tantric, but he's also an aesthetician. And in one of his books, he addresses the question, why do we, when we see characters on a stage, how are we able to identify and feel what they're feeling, even though they're completely unlike us? And so there's this idea that what they call memory traces, that's the English translation, sanskaras, which are deep within us. And he says, every man, before he has been himself, has been everything else, right? So you have the memory traces of every other being in the universe inside you. So, and that's what happens, is that the play then brings up certain set of memory traces that become alive in your consciousness, right? And this is coming from the tradition of reincarnation, of course, right? So like your memory goes back thousands of generations. But I think even if you don't believe that, this idea that deep within there are these buried memory traces that come alive, right?
We are basically everybody, right? That's sort of everybody is everybody at the same time. Yeah. Okay, let's keep talking about memory, and I believe that reading is, to me, a crucial part of what we remember and what we are as writers. And I don't know about you, but many times what one reads finds its way, sometimes in the way of style, sometimes it gets into the plot of the stories that we write. It becomes, it merges with what we actually do. And I know about Vikram that you sometimes have described yourself as a bookish little kid when you were growing up, right? And you've read obviously the Indian epic narratives, Ramayana, Mahabharata, okay? I read some plays that you actually read Oliver Twist when you were in third grade, is that?
A little older, yeah. Fourth,
okay,
fifth
correct.
grade.
And also in some of your novels, for example, in Red Earth and Pouring Rain, I see very clear references to 101 Nights, or even to Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. All right, so I see all that stuff over there. I don't know if what I see is correct or not. And I was talking to Javier before, and you told me that, for example, Émile Zola was a very important influence. And usually, when you are growing up, later I think we become a little harder when it comes to influences. But what can you say about reading as a source of your writing? Well,
I think you have to read a lot before starting writing. it's in there. And when I do these creative courses, sometimes the advice I give to the students is to read a lot and not to be afraid of copying at the beginning. You know, because by the time then you refine and you revise and you rewrite, the thing will not look alike. Will not look like what the original that you've inspired, you got your inspiration. But it's good as an exercise to free yourself. You can free your hand there, and start really copying things that you like. And by the end of it, it will not look like the beginning. You know, that's one advice I do. For example, before starting any book, I write in Spanish. I usually take books of García Márquez, any which one. I don't care. I'm not going to read them linearly, but I need to hear the tone, the good Spanish tone, the music of it, and that helps start. It helps start the writing on my side. There are little tricks that you use like that to be able to, you know, to enter the process of writing, which is you said that it was like cooking. Well, it's not really like cooking, because cooking you put the thing on the stove or in the oven and you wait, so you can do something else. Whether when you're writing, I mean, you're there minute after minute and you're absolutely a slave of your work. I mean, there is a part of writing after the research. For me, is the best part, and I think you were saying the same thing. Yeah, because it's the part where we're human beings. We talk to other people. We visit places. We visit museums, archives. We interview people. So we feel alive. We dream our book. And then there is the hard part, which is when you have to become a monk, and you have to impose a self-discipline. Otherwise, your work will never be done. It's impossible. And that's a tough part. And within that part, there's also subparts. The toughest part for me is the very beginning of a book. The first 50 pages are pure torture. It's when you say, why am I doing this? I'm not a writer. I never knew how to write. I should have done something else. Why did I choose that subject? My God, it is a mortifying journey that lasts like a month or two. And if things start going well, hopefully it happens, then the whole thing changes. And instead of you pulling the cart pulls you, and the characters start pulling you out. So instead of going to bed at night wondering what is the scene that tomorrow I will have to write, you already know the scene because your characters have already told you what the scenes are. That's the magic of it. That's the beauty of this officio, you know, the craft, you know, is that at one point, something that was in your mind has a life of its own and carries you towards the end. And even sometimes it works. It can be fantastic then.
I don't know if you agree or
Yeah.
it's a similar experience.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the torture is like throughout.
The torture.
It's like all the way through. I mean, and like, you know, like you were saying. Oh, sorry. Oh, I was just saying that for me, the torturous part lasts the entire time. For me, especially the first draft. I think maybe that's, for me, like, once I've got the first draft done, I more or less know what the story is. And then, like, I don't feel like I've already dug the foundations. Now I'm, like, building the walls, which is a lot easier. And then, like, further thing, you're doing little decorative touches. So I also wanted to say, in relation to what you were saying earlier, that you have to read, right? The narratives you first grow up with as a kid, the stories you're reading or your people are telling you, I see this in my kids, right? They're very clearly shaped by the first fairy tales they read, right? What their expectations are of narrative. And then, like, you learn from your masters, right? So what I tell my students is that, you know, particularly when a book is so wonderful for you that you lose yourself in it, that it makes a difference in your life, you go back to it again and again. Well, part of reading it for the 15th time is maybe you will start to see the craft that made it work that way, right? So Francine Prose has a wonderful book called Reading Like a Writer, and she talks about this early process of being shaped by books and then going back to those books and reading to see what the music is created by, right? What is like how did they plot this thing, right? And I drive my students crazy because we do that every class, right? We read something and then we try and like see the elements of it, right? How it's been done.
Actually, I don't know if you agree with me. I believe that readers don't have to be writers, but writers have to be readers. I don't
100%.
see any other way of passively becoming a... So I don't know if you agree with me here also. I believe that when it comes to writing, there are certain families. We are the children to other writers who came before us. And in a way, I totally agree that we begin to write by imitation. We do everything by imitation at the beginning, talking, hearing, everything. But do you consider yourself members of a certain family? Okay, to give you an example, I think I'm the children of a certain part of the Anglo-Saxon realist American tradition of fiction writing. I see William Faulkner as my great-great-grandfather, okay? I consider that part of my family. I don't know if you can, identify like a family tree there or not, or you just...
In my case, it was my real family, because I started writing with Dominique Lapierre and Larry Collins, so Dominique being my uncle, I had it very easy.
Yeah.
I must say, and I used to work for them as one of the researchers they used to hire for their books. That's how I learned the craft. And then I wrote a book with Dominique about the tragedy of Bhopal, which I think is one of the best books we've written. It's really a good portrait of the India of the slums, and the India also that was the beginning of industrialization. And yes, I'm from that family of writers. My grandmother was a writer, my great-granduncle was a writer, my cousin is a writer, my brother wrote 2 books. So I mean, if you talk about family, in my case, it's my straight family.
It's a biological family there. Yeah. Okay. I don't know about you, Vikram.
Yeah, well, same. My mother's a writer, fiction, screenwriter, and my sister is I have 2 sisters. The middle one, they're both younger. The middle one is a screenwriter and director, and often our discussions around the kitchen table used to be, and I mean, we watch a movie, right? And then we come home and then we do this industry discussion of the movie, right? Why was that such a terrible plot? Or why did it flop? They spent millions and millions of rupees on it. So, my earliest memories of my mother are also seeing her write on the kitchen table with a pen on these big, long, full-scape sheets of paper, right? So I'm sure that for me, as well as the stories that she and my grandmothers and my aunts told me, right? And then, when I was growing up in India, and I think still, we have this in the school texts and around us, these strange mixture of, Victorian novels. You talked about Oliver Twist and Shakespeare. For us in middle school, we're struggling with Shakespeare sitting in India, right? And Shakespeare is a huge presence in India still. And then, the thrillers American thrillers that we read out of school, Don Quixote, right. Cervantes.
I was going to say.
Yeah. I mean, so I first encountered that novel. There was this old series, excuse me, called Classics Comics, right? Those of you of a certain age will remember these. So they would take classics of the Western tradition and put them in comic form. And so I used to read those avidly, and I read those, I think, starting must have been when I was 8 and 9 and 10, and there was Don Quixote, right? And so then when I went to college in the States, in a class, I read the entire novel and was completely blown away and moved by it. So this morning I went to the house, and it was like a pilgrimage, right? With 4 people, and they all left, and I said, can I just sit here for a while, you guys go? And that's where you found me afterwards, still sitting. And then Hemingway, right? The books in India were very expensive when I was growing up relative to people's incomes. So there were these lending libraries all over the place, and you went and paid 2 rupees or 3 rupees, and you got to check out a book for a few days. And I used to read thrillers and Westerns because we were all obsessed with America. And one day I see this book, which has a very colorful cover, and it has a charging lion and this hunter with a big rifle and this beautiful woman. And I'm like, that looks exciting, so I take it out home, and it turns out to be one of those things where the publisher takes a literary fiction and puts this pulp cover to make people buy it, and it turned out to be the short stories of Ernest Hemingway, right? And I read those stories. I knew nothing about Hemingway. But it made the hairs on my arm stand up, right? And that was my obsession with the beginning of my obsession with American modernists.
Yeah. To close the chapter on memory, we've discussed our own experience and also our vicarious experience through reading. Let's talk about the experience of others, all right? And then, Javier, you actually mentioned that before when you talked about research and interviewing people. And Vikram, I think you've said someplace that, talking about, you say that one of the best ways to learn about the world is to interview people. And you say you'd be amazed if you ask, people are amazingly willing to talk.
Yes. Yes.
So basically, what we are doing here is collecting the experience of others and transforming that experience into our own work. How important is that? Well, Javier, you mentioned that before when you talked about research, I believe.
Yes, for me it's of the utmost importance. And in fact, you're right. I mean, every human being needs a psychologist, and when you're interviewing someone, you're playing the part of being a little bit of a psychologist. But it's absolutely true, from mafia dons to poor victims of the Bhopal gas tragedy to Brazilian peasants, whoever, they love to talk. They need to talk. I mean, what an honor for them and what a pleasure it is for them to be able to give their story, their point of view. And that is the material of my books, and I think yours also, the basic material. Son los ladrillos con los que vamos a construir luego el libro, estas entrevistas, porque that's where your characters are shaped, that's where you find your characters, that's where you find a good story. And suddenly, I have a method. I always want to give little tricks, because in case someone wants to write, you know. I always go to an interview with two tape recorders, and I take notes at the same time. Because taking notes already, it's a way to prioritize, priorizar los datos.
To understand.
It's the beginning of the... And I always transcribe that interview myself. I don't give it to a secretary and then read it, because it doesn't penetrate me enough. The real work for me starts after the interview, and I go and I transcribe the whole thing, which is long, and it's a lot of work. In my last book, which will come out in September, which I just finished, it's based on 250 interviews. You can imagine how much time I've spent transcribing those interviews. But that's the fundamental material with which you're gonna write the book. And sometimes, and I leave it long when I interview people, and I don't want to, I never end the story, because they may say the most important thing when they think you're not interviewing them anymore. Yeah. At the very end. Did it happen to you?
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And so I mean, especially with this crime novel, I made sure I told them up front, I'm not a journalist, because they get very careful in a different way. Not that they would tell me like some, fact, like, so, and at some, I mean, like you're saying, it's often if you reach this strange like moment, they're not telling their story to you, they're telling the story to themselves, because we're all story-driven creatures, and we want to make sense out of the chaos of our lives, right? And then you just shut up and let them talk, right? And it's wonderful. And I tell them, again, I'm talking about my students a lot because we're talking about craft. I tell my students this: if you're going to set a story in a hospital, go and talk to doctors and nurses and patients. And again, you'll be amazed. Like, I mean, doctors don't get interviewed, nurses don't get interviewed. I mean, maybe they get interviewed for like technical details, but you're asking about their lives, and they're so eager to tell you, and they will talk and talk and talk. And that's where you collect not just the like coarse detail about what it must feel like to be a nurse. That's where you get the texture.
Yeah.
Right?
And the humanity, that's what it is. And the humanity is in the detail, in whatever the nurse tells you about her daily struggle. What are her conflicts? What is she faced to? I mean, all those things come out of being a big ear and having the lowest possible profile.
Yes.
So you become a listener, and you listen. At the end, you get stuff.
Yeah, Nabokov,
I should say that, like, sorry. Interviewing like some of in that crime book, there were moments at which I felt like I don't want to be responsible for the information you're giving me, because I don't want you to come back to me 3 years from now and say, like, you burned me.
Well, yeah. That happens many times also, is that people talk, then you write what they told you, and they come say, how dare you write how dare you write this? I said, well, you told me that story. Well, I never thought you were writing it like this. How did you want me to write it? I just told what you told me. This happened. It happened with Maharaj of Kapurthala also.
Yeah.
I mean, these guys, they talked, and then when they saw it on writing, they didn't like it. I mean,
that's
those
why
things happen.
I don't want to know the specific details of how you murdered that guy, right? Just tell me the technique, right? And like how you laid out your net of deception or whatever. Right?
I think that illustrates one of the differences between reality and fiction. Those people are speaking reality to you. They don't agree with it when they see it in fiction. They're totally two different spheres. Okay, one is reality.
They don't see them. It's very difficult that the image of a...
Microphone.
It's very difficult that somebody's image coincides with the image that a writer that has studied that character ends up writing. It's very difficult. That's why I've always had problems with my books, because they're all based on real characters, or characters whose ancestors have, still their memories is alive. And that's why I always had these problems, because they don't agree. This is not the way I see my family. You portrayed my family, it's not the way. We are Maharajas of Kapurthala, I go to Kapurthala and I have a line of peasants licking my boots today. So how dare you treat my grandfather like this? And so I did listen. It's all in the British Library. It's all in the India office of the British Library. There you can see how your great-grandfather was. He was a great ruler, yes, no question about that. But he was a medieval ruler. He owned the people, and he was a womanizer. He made pregnant a Savoy hotel maid, and she sued him, and she won, and he had to pay a fortune. I didn't say that. I didn't put that in the book, because I didn't want to diminish my male character, but I could have, and but the family didn't see it that way, they thought their grandfather was Churchill.
I totally agree about the detail. Vladimir Nabokov used to, when he, taught creative writing, he used to advise his students to mind the details, the divine details, he called them, the divine details, okay? So, so much for memory, okay? Let's move on and talk about we're talking about the intangible, but what we're going to talk about now is the amazingly intangible, which is the imagination, okay? I was reading an article a couple of days ago that came out in a newspaper in Spain. There's this neuroscientist, maybe some of you know him, his name is Ignacio Morgado, and he's published a book on the mind and the way it works and the imagination. And this is a neuroscientist, okay? And he says that science still doesn't have a clue where the imagination comes from. We don't know how that part of the brain works. So that's why we're talking about the intangible.
I think imaginations come from siestas.
Yeah, all right.
Really, I mean, a good nap can unlock a plot.
No, I am a big napper.
Me too.
Me too. And I was, half of my brain is like all mystical and tantric and like, woo-woo. But like a good peer-reviewed scientific paper gives me a very warm, fuzzy feeling inside, especially when it confirms what I want to believe. And so recently there was a paper that said, napping increases creativity and problem-solving thing, and I sent it to my whole family, especially my kids who make fun of me for napping.
My mother used to scold me, you're not doing anything, because I was lying down in a hammock, and I said, I'm working, ma. I'm working. I was writing my first book,
I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Lucia Berlin. She's an American writer. She died a few years ago, and one of her most beautiful books is A Manual for Cleaning Women. And everything, according to critics, is autobiographical. Basically, she's writing about her life. Now, when her children, who are grown-up men, now they're in their 50s, in their 60s, when they read her books, they don't recognize themselves. And they say, oh, that didn't happen. I never said that. Mom never was there. And I assume, I don't know if you agree with me, that the difference between those two versions of whatever happened is the imagination, is what you use to transform reality, and you dramatize it into something that's palatable and readable and enjoyable to everybody else. I don't know if you agree with that idea.
Yeah, so wait, say that again. That was very complex.
Actually, to give you an example, talking about the imagination, for example, Vikram, you talk about the writing process, and I've gotten some quotations from you. You talk about when you begin to write. So you basically have the rough idea, right, and then there's a vague presence of a character in my head. Yeah. Vague, okay? Then there's maybe an outline of a body, right, okay? Then there's a hint of an emotion, a glimpse of a landscape. Now, how does that stuff move into actual words, right, and the actual plot of the story? And the same question for you. How does that happen? I don't know if we actually know.
It's very mysterious for me. It's really very mysterious, because there is not a rule. Sometimes a story pops up because you read a newspaper article and it sparks something in you. Other times a friend tells you, listen, why don't you have a look at this story? And then you have a look and says, God, this is fantastic. Sometimes it's talking to a friend or interviewing someone, or out of your research then comes there may be other books that come later, but there's not a rule. And what I think, and that comes to what you said yesterday, when you finish a book, you're very happy because you've crossed the Himalayas, and you give it to the publisher, and you have like a fantastic moment of exaltation, you know. And then 1 week later, you're depressed because you don't have your characters anymore. Imagine if you're a reader and you've been reading a book for 15 hours and you don't want it to finish because you're attached to these characters. Imagine a writer who has been not 15 hours, but 3 years living with his characters. You know, I was going to bed imagining how the neck of Sonia Gandhi would smell and things like that, you know, for years. And then suddenly there's no neck, there's no Sonia Gandhi, there's nothing. You're back to your own daily life, you know, going to buy bread, going to the what I'm going to do with the children this weekend. You just have this reality, and you don't have that other reality where you have lived. I don't know what I was telling you that, though. But I was going to a point.
Yeah. So, I mean, for me, like you were saying, there's this landscape, emotional, and then there's...
Oh, I know.
Yeah, and the character, like, hints of the character appear. And so, like, then it's, for me, it's like getting to know somebody I don't know too well, right? So they become, like, what is the word? Like, they reveal more dimensions. Like, for the first time I wrote about my cop, Sartaj Singh, I mean, there's certain things that were just there, right? Like, I knew he was a Sikh, for instance. I didn't understand at the point, and still don't why. Exactly. I can do, like, post-game, like, analysis. And then I knew he was very handsome, and then I knew he was a snappy dresser. He was vain, right? But then his mother appears, his dead father appears, right? And it's like getting to know a new friend. And then, like you said, you're stuck with these people for years, right?
For years. They become your family, more than your family. But I was talking the process a little bit earlier than that. When you finish a book and you have that void, then your mind wants to fill it with another story. And that is where you're the most receptive. No, you have like antennas. That is where you find your character. You find or you find something that is gonna rope you in another story that's gonna take 4 years of your life. And this in between, it's like these animals that, you know, you're ready to be seduced.
Right. Yeah, we're actually talking about the spaces in between. Something that something that you've mentioned a couple of times in the conversation today. We've been talking about being faithful to reality, writing about what actually happened. And what I'd like to add, why not being unfaithful? We are fiction writers. So why is it legitimate to use the material that comes to us and actually change it, alter it, do whatever we want with it? Because when those books go on sale, they're called novels, fiction. So what do you think about that? Basically, being unfaithful.
Right. So I mean, I have no compunctions about making fictional events or making these characters. I gather detail, I mix them together. I have people behave not like maybe the inspiring people did in real life. But I have to admit that I'm obsessive about getting details right, and I don't quite understand why, right? So to give you an example, when Sacred Games was published, I got an email from a woman who was a firearms instructor in Virginia. And what I had done was I had my gangster, he takes out a Glock, right? Like very popular American weapon in America. And I have him, before he kills the guy, he clicks the safety off, right? And she pointed out to me, she said, Glocks don't have safeties, right? That's why the police like them. You pull it and you shoot. I was like, wait, I'm ashamed of this. How could I get this wrong? So I go through my 25 notebooks, I find the interview, and this cop had shown me very proudly his Glock because they were unusual in India at the time, and he was very proud of his privately bought American sophisticated weapon from abroad. And he had a safety, right? And so then I go look around and it says, I learned that there's an aftermarket for safeties added to Glock because you get them and then you start shooting yourself in the foot, right? And so then I emailed back to her and she said, wow, I didn't know about this. Right. And we had this lovely conversation. And then so in the next edition, when they did the next print, he pulls a pistol, not a Glock. So I don't know why I want to get it so right, but it makes me unhappy to get it wrong, and then it makes me happy to get it.
Because writing a novel or writing fiction doesn't mean that you write anything, that anything goes, no. Yeah. It has to have its own coherence. It has to have its own logic, otherwise the thing doesn't work.
Yeah, but I didn't mean destroying that. I meant creating a narrative that works.
The good thing about literature is it's a reflection of life, and there is room for everything. Everything is admitted as long as it works. Now you have to make it work.
Okay. They tell me we have 5 minutes left, so let me cram 2 questions into one. The final ingredient that I mentioned at the beginning was language. So my question is, language is, for better or for worse, the only tool that we writers have to convey whatever we want to say. So what's your approach to language? And then just to wrap it up, we've been talking about where writing comes from. And I'd like you to make a little brief, daring prediction as to where do you think writing is going? Fiction writing, what's the future of fiction writing, the novel? So that's it.
I mean, like you're saying, it's the tool we have. And so you want to invite the reader to get lost in your world, right? And your primary first tool, even before character, is the texture, the weight of words, the rhythms, right? And I was talking about my encounter with Hemingway, and it was that prose of his, right? It seems it's deceptively simple, but when you start really listening, you realize how hard he worked on it, right? And also for me, that first encounter with what I'm writing is language. And that's one of the toughest parts, right? I can take characters, build them with details, but every morning, I think maybe you feel there's this fear, can I ever write another good sentence? What the fuck am I doing? This is a horrible sentence.
Yeah, you have that fear, and there's a lot of correction. I mean, I write in the morning and I correct what I've written in the afternoon. And it's and you revise and revise and revise. You want the music of it, you want the text to be right, and you want to share. You're always looking for the sharp word, the word that better defines what you're trying to say. And it's not easy for me, it helps me being bilingual, because sometimes it pops up in French, so then I can, but it's part of the craft, and you spend lots of hours into, it's like, you know, when you do your bread, you know, you estás amasando pan. You mass your text, you know, you pull it, everything that que sobra, lo quitas. You try to be the most concise. It's very hard to read simple. Usually when you read simple is because there's a lot of work behind. Because that's probably the hardest part. And when the reader tells you, oh, I got involved immediately, like Pallavi has been involved in your book. She started reading it yesterday. She couldn't stop reading it already. So that is the reward of a good use of language.
That's actually the part of writing that readers should never know about. How hard it is to write a simple, plain, precise sentence.
Yeah, people don't look at plumbery at their houses either.
And how about that prediction, to wrap it up before the Q&A session, a prediction about the future of writing? We have artificial intelligence coming strong. What's going to happen? This is not binding, okay?
If artificial intelligence can help us at least, you know, organize the material, why not? But I wouldn't let the full stop be written by the ChatGPT program.
Right. I mean, I think like the management of the research that we do is so difficult. That's why I made the software. That's exactly, it helps you do that, right? And and I'm pushing a couple of friends of mine, you know, it can answer questions about all this world. Build me something I can ask questions about what's on my laptop. And I will pay you big money if you do that for me, right? And that's for writing. I don't know, like the reason I write is not to complete a story. It's to learn something about this world that I don't know about, and then painfully sometimes, and in a frightening way, to reach deep down and have these things come up, right?
Yeah, maybe we write out of curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's no more to it.
Yes.
Absolutely. How we're doing time-wise? Can we start the Q&A session?
I have a question for Javier. And, you know, it's about specifically the books that you did, for example, on Sonia Gandhi or Anita Delgado. Why did you choose not to either make them real histories, like, you know, histories where it's non-fiction, or use the characters but completely fictionalize them into unrecognizable people? And instead you kind of, it sort of seems to fall between these genres of a novel and of a history. And so what's the thought process behind that? And isn't it kind of a slightly tricky territory? You were saying the Kapurthalas get angry with you, but that's because you are talking about Kapurthala, you're talking about real people, you haven't changed the names, you haven't changed the place. So it sort of comes across as a biography, but then it's fictionalized. So
yeah, well, I always walked in that fine line, you know. And why not? As I was telling you before, in this cocina, everything is accepted, or everything, if it works, why not? But my genre is more recreating history than doing what they call fiction history. I mean, novela histórica. I don't do novela histórica. Novela histórica is where you put fiction characters and you make them interact with real characters. I don't know really how to do that. What I do is I reconstruct pieces of history with all the characters there. And I fictionalize in the sense that I write the dialogues, but also always based on a research and a documentation. I try not to go very far. When I reconstructed the death of Indira Gandhi at the All India Institute of Health there in Delhi, I talked to the people the politicians that were there. When Rajiv came that night and said I have to accept the prime ministership. And she said, no, that's not our pact. They had a discussion there. They were listening to that. So what did I do? I went to the fifth floor of the All India Institute. I could describe how it was. I could describe the smell of the place. I could see what you see from the windows. And then I could, after interviewing these guys, I could reconstruct that scene, which is a heartbreaking scene, important in their relationships. That's how I do it. It takes a long time, but I don't like to invent something totally of people that are alive. I mean, I don't think it's very, you know, and that's how I proceed, and that's how I do it. But of course, there's always an interpretation. I mean, and that interpretation may not satisfy the relatives or part of the family, because you're always, in fact, you're in a very fine line.
Was there another question? Anybody? No? Yep.
I think this is for Javier also. I think reconstructing things reminds me of Kurosawa, no? And the film, we all know where, you know, whatever happens now in this room, if you ask each of one outside what happened, what did you just do, or what any, we will all tell you a different story. So in your reconstruction process, what stance do you take? Do you try to be somewhere in between the characters, or how do you work in a way so that you don't take sides?
Yeah, I don't want to. I never take sides. I don't want to take sides, even though I take sides. I mean that I let through what happens to the characters, the reader gets an idea of what things are. My last book, which is about Venezuela and of the characters that have opposed the regime, I mean, it's very clear how this works, because you only have to follow what happens to these people to understand the bigger picture of it.
And the same question in fiction. Do you struggle to take sides sometimes? Do you have empathy with some of your characters, but you say, oh, I can't take sides, I have to leave him, and then maybe now take sides with this new character? How does it work in fiction, the taking sides?
No, I mean, I think part of the delight and the problem of fiction is that if you're writing about a gangster, a monster, you have to get inside his head to be actually able to write it from his point of view, right? And I think for the most part, nobody is ever a villain inside their own heads, right? So how do you do that inner narrative is by escaping this tendency to like or dislike someone to whatever extent. And then I guess, I just wanted to add to what you were saying, even that footnoted thing that labels itself as history is a fiction, right? And any narrative that you build is a matter of choices, and so that thing that you build is shaped by your consciousness and the story that you want to tell.
I would say so even for storybooks, history books. I mean, the same historical fact can be told by two different historians at two different nationalities or two different moments of their history, and they're going to be completely different books. So objectivity, it's a name, but it's not an end in itself. It's an impossibility.
Right, and I think this is the thing that often we need to teach our kids, that the reason I'm thinking about this, my older daughter, Leela, just went into 9th grade, and we went to meet each of the teachers to say, well, what are you doing in class? And the history teacher said, we don't teach history here, we teach how people do history. And I was like, that's so meta, man, that's so exciting. I wish somebody had taught me this in 9th grade, right? This idea that every history is an interpretation. And particularly, I mean, we have these arguments, right? Like these, I was talking to my friend this morning about what's happening in India right now, is according to me, they're rewriting history as a fantasy, right? And spreading these amazing, Indians invented the plane in 5000 BC or 10,000 BC. And people buy into this, and it seems to me absurd, but they're doing their version of history. I mean, shaped by your environment. Yeah. The environment at that time, and then what you need as a human being to feel valued, right? And you're part of this glory, right, of a culture or whatever.
Vikram, this is for you. Since you now know that your novels are being made into, net series or whatever, do you ever write it from that angle? Or do you leave that to...
No. I wish I could. Maybe I'll make some money, but no, right? Because one reason, there's a couple of reasons. My family is all in film, and just for simple nepotism would have given me an entry. And I tasted a little bit of it, and I thought this is not for me, is that I'm very aware that it's a completely different grammar there, and I don't have a feeling for that, right? I know how to move prose along, the timing of a paragraph, how long a scene should be, but when I try and write a screenplay by myself, I completely mess that up, right? The scene is too long, the rhythm is not right. And so whenever I've done that, I love working with people who are actually screenwriters, and then we can collaborate on the narrative and its shape.
And kind of connected, do you ever think what your reader is going to imagine when you're writing something? Or is it just your imagination?
No, so I have a set of intended audience in my head. Right? It's often my sisters and a couple of very close friends, because I feel like I'm speaking to them, and I know their tastes, and I can kind of think about how they will receive it, right? So to write I guess for me, the storytelling urge always includes an audience. And even though I imagine people, people that I know, I understand also that it's very imaginary. And in Indian aesthetic thinking, there's this idea that somewhere out there's a reader who's a Sahridaya. And what that means is same-hearted, right? Sa is same, and Hridaya is your heart. And the idea is that reader is the appropriate and perhaps perfect listener to the story that you're telling. And, that might exist in the future, right? There's a very, one poet, from I think about 800 years ago, and he's very arrogant. He says, nobody in my time will understand the complexity of what I'm doing, but somewhere in the future I will find my readers and they will love me.
There's a question down there. I think one final question before we...
Hola, buenas tardes. Mi pregunta es para Javier. ¿Qué le impulsó a escribir la historia de Anita Delgado? ¿Qué fuentes utilizó? Es una historia apasionante, desde luego el salto de esa jovencita que llegó allí al Rajastán, que aprendió sánscrito, que luchó por integrarse en la sociedad, ¿no?
¿Les contesto en español?
Como quiera.
Sí,
me apasionó la historia. Entonces,
no, yo es que había pasado 3 años escribiendo el libro de Bhopal, que fue una experiencia bastante dura, porque me obligó a vivir en la ciudad de Bhopal, a entrevistar a las víctimas, y quería un poco contar algo que me hiciese soñar un poco con la otra India, la India que uno tiene en la cabeza, esa imagen del final del Imperio Británico. Y conocí por casualidad a una pariente del Marajá de Kapurthala que me dijo, tú no conoces a la mujer de mi tío, el Marajá. Y le dije, pues no, porque murió en el 64, y en el 64 tenía 10 años. Pues mira, entonces me contó cosas que no se sabían de ella. Y pensé que podía ser una historia, que podía contar la historia del final del Raj británico a través de los ojos de una española. Y eso me pareció original. Y me lancé a ello sin jamás pensar que ese libro funcionaría más que un poco. Pero luego fue una sorpresa grande, claro. Y luego investigué mucho. Claro, yo tenía las claves para investigar en la India. Pude investigar la vida de ella en la India, porque lo que se había escrito se paraba antes. Era potentado oriental, se casa con pobre bailarina y la convierte en princesa. Bueno, ¿y luego qué? Todos sabemos que la vida no es un cuento de hadas. ¿Qué pasó luego? Entonces, eso lo pude investigar porque yo ya estaba acostumbrado a trabajar en la India y tenía las claves para poder llegar a la gente y llegar a las fuentes, ¿no?, de la investigación, y así lo hice.
Okay, shall we wrap up? Shall I do it in Spanish or shall I say goodbye in... I just want to say, as you can imagine, como podéis imaginar, podríamos estar hablando de la escritura hasta la hora de cenar, porque es fascinante. Yo tengo que decir, antes de terminar, lo contento que estoy de estar aquí por muchas razones, pero una es que me parece absolutamente milagroso por un lado y maravilloso que nos sigamos reuniendo de esta forma para hablar de literatura en este mundo en el que vivimos, para hablar de escritura, porque al final las historias son casi lo último que nos queda para entender este mundo loco en el que vivimos. Así que quería agradecer a todos los presentes por estar aquí esta mañana casi lluviosa en Valladolid. Thank you, Javier, thank you, Vikram, for your generosity and for sharing all those little secrets and those little ideas about your craft with everybody. Okay, so thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Bueno, reitero las gracias a Vikram Chandra, Javier Moro y Rubén Abella por esta sesión tan interesante. Queremos también agradecer al Ayuntamiento de Valladolid y la Feria del Libro, la Junta de Castilla y León y nuestros anfitriones, el Círculo de Recreo. Queremos ofrecer una muestra de agradecimiento a nuestros ponentes por participar en este evento que marca un hito. La siguiente sesión de esta tarde será a las 5:30 en esta sala. Se titula Ficción, la literatura de los viajes, con Pallavi Ayar, Javier Moro y Tariq Hussein. Y la última sesión de esta tarde será a las 6:45. Historias que debo contar, la vida de un actor, con Kabir Bedi en conversación con Sanjoy Roy.